Welcome to Bedtime Stories. Here, we delve into the past to make your sleep easy and enlightening. Don't forget to subscribe and like, because by the end of the story, you'll be sound asleep. Close your eyes. The story begins. Imagine waking up, stepping outside, and the world is unrecognizable. The city is deserted. Communication is down. There's no information, and chaos reigns. But most frightening of all is the complete lack of understanding of what to do next. This scenario is the quintessence of humanity's fear of the end of the world. We fear not only destruction, but also the unknown, the loss of control, and the collapse of the familiar world. Psychologists argue that the fear of the end of the world is primarily linked to the loss of predictability. Humans exist in a world where everything follows a certain rhythm. The sun rises every morning, spring follows winter, time flows in its course. Any thought of the apocalypse shatters this sense of stability, plunging the consciousness into chaos. Moreover, the unknown is often more terrifying than the catastrophe itself. Death isn't scary. It's an inevitable part of life that we encounter every day. We are terrified by what we don't know will happen afterward. An instant end or a prolonged destruction, emptiness, or something beyond understanding. This fear intensifies when it becomes collective. If one person is worried, they look for a solution. But when fear is fueled by society, religious prophecies, scientific theories, or rumors on social media, it turns into a powerful cultural phenomenon. That's why myths about the end of the world have always existed, from the ancient Sumerians and Mayans to modern conspiracy theorists. It is noteworthy that talk of the end of the world intensifies during periods of social and political upheaval. History shows that the more unstable a society, the more people think about global catastrophe. When the world feels chaotic, familiar foundations crumble, and diseases cause anxiety. Ancient archetypes of destruction come to life in the mass consciousness. Think back to ancient Rome at the end of the 1st century AD. Frequent changes of emperors, instability in the state, and popular unrest. It was then that Christian ideas about the coming Last Judgment spread. In the Middle Ages, the expectation of the end of the world intensified during epidemics, when the plague devastated cities and people saw it as divine punishment. Even in modern times, we observe similar processes. In 1999, fear of a computer glitch with the arrival of the year 2000 caused mass psychosis. People expected the collapse of civilization due to the change of date in the system. But curiously, in many cultures, the end of the world is not annihilation, but rebirth. In Norse mythology, after Ragnarok, a new land remains, where surviving people and gods begin a new era. The Mayan books describe that our world is not the first and not the last. Before it, there were other eras, each of which ended in catastrophe, but then a new one appeared. In Hinduism, Kali Yuga, the current Dark Age, will end in destruction, but it will be followed by a golden age. Thus, the fear of the end of the world is not only anxiety about a catastrophe, but also hope for renewal. Myths not only express fear, but also carry a deep faith in a new order. Stories about the end of the world are based on ancient texts, traditions, and real catastrophes that humanity has experienced for millennia. But it is interesting, not only their origin, but also why people passed them down from generation to generation. Perhaps the most vivid descriptions of the end of the world are found in ancient texts created by different cultures in different places and eras. All these sources paint a similar picture. The world collapses, plunges into chaos, but then invariably revives. One of the key sources of ideas about the end of the world in Northern Europe is the Elder Edda. It describes Ragnarok, the final battle of the gods and the destruction of the world. This myth is full of symbolism: ice giants, the uprising of monsters, the death of the gods, and the subsequent rebirth of nature. Many researchers believe that this myth could reflect real climatic changes. For example, a sudden cold snap caused by a volcanic eruption. The Bible offers several stories related to the end of the world. The Great Flood in the book of Genesis is described as God's punishment, destroying humanity except for Noah and his family. This story is found not only in Judaism and Christianity, but also in Sumerian texts, for example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The coincidence of details is striking. For the Mayan civilization, the end of the world was not annihilation, but a change of cycles. The sacred book, Popol Vuh, tells how several worlds existed before ours, but were destroyed due to the imperfection of the first people. One world is flooded, another is destroyed by fire. The idea of epochs changing through catastrophes is characteristic of other Mesoamerican civilizations as well. The Aztecs, for example, believed that the current world is the fifth in a row, and it awaits death in fire and earthquakes. The question of how much the myths about the end of the world are based on real events has long concerned scientists. In recent decades, archaeology and geology have been searching for possible catastrophes that could have formed the basis of these legends. One of the most popular hypotheses connects the biblical flood with a geological catastrophe in the Black Sea region about 7,600 years ago. The level of the Mediterranean Sea rose sharply, and water poured into the Black Sea, flooding vast territories. For the people who lived there, this could really look like the end of the world. Around 1600 BC, one of the most powerful eruptions in history shook the island of Santorini in the Aegean Sea. It caused a giant tsunami that destroyed the Minoan civilization on Crete. Some researchers believe that this cataclysm could have given rise to myths about the destruction of Atlantis. Possible collisions of the Earth with meteorites also left a mark in myths. The Tunguska event in 1908 caused an explosion with the power of thousands of atomic bombs. Had it happened over a densely populated region, a new myth about the wrath of the gods could well have appeared. But many of these theories are just attempts to explain real catastrophes. Why did myths continue to exist for centuries and spread even among those who did not witness the events? One of the most striking myths, where the end of the world is presented not only as a tragedy, but also as an inevitable renewal, is Ragnarok, the last battle of the gods in the Scandinavian tradition. This myth has come down to us through oral traditions and ancient texts, but over time it has undergone changes, reflecting the influence of new religions and historical events. Ragnarok is one of the most famous myths about the end of the world, coming from the Scandinavian tradition. It is the story of the final battle of the gods, the destruction of the world, and its subsequent rebirth. However, like other ancient myths, the idea of Ragnarok was formed over the centuries, absorbing the influence of various traditions, oral legends, and even religious ideas that appeared in Scandinavia with the advent of Christianity. The main written sources containing a description of Ragnarok are the Elder Edda and the Younger Edda. The Elder Edda, or Poetic Edda, is a collection of mythological and heroic songs recorded in the 13th century, but based on much more ancient oral traditions. One of the most important songs, Prophecy of the Vulva, contains a detailed description of the events of Ragnarok, including the signs of the impending catastrophe, the awakening of monsters, the death of the gods, and the subsequent renewal of the world. This text is considered one of the oldest and most authentic testimonies of Scandinavian beliefs, as it shows less influence of the Christian tradition compared to later sources. The Younger Edda, or Prose Edda, was written in the 13th century by the Icelandic historian and poet Snorri Sturluson. Unlike the Elder Edda, this text is a more systematized and retold version of Scandinavian mythology, adapted for the understanding of Snorri's contemporaries. In his description of Ragnarok, the influence of Christian ideas about the end of the world is felt, which is especially noticeable in the details of the subsequent rebirth of the world. For example, according to Snorri, after the destruction of the world, a new land appears on which righteous souls will live, and the myth itself acquires the features of a linear narrative, similar to the Christian idea of the apocalypse. However, despite the existence of written sources, it should be remembered that the myth of Ragnarok existed for a long time in the form of oral traditions. The Scandinavians did not have a developed writing system. Their religious beliefs were passed down from generation to generation through stories, ritual chants, and performances by skalds, ancient poets who performed epic poems at the courts of konungs and jarls. It was in this oral tradition that details of the myth could be contained that did not make it into written sources or changed when they were recorded. The myth of Ragnarok was formed in a complex cultural environment where pagan beliefs gradually clashed with Christianity. During the Christianization of Scandinavia, which was especially active from the 10th to the 12th century, Viking mythology inevitably underwent changes. The new religion sought to displace the old beliefs, but it could not immediately erase them from the popular consciousness. Therefore, many elements of Scandinavian mythology began to be interpreted through the prism of Christian symbolism. For example, the idea that only surviving righteous souls will remain in the new world after Ragnarok could have been borrowed from the Christian idea of the Last Judgment. Another possible influence of Christianity is the image of the great wolf Fenrir, who on the day of Ragnarok breaks his bonds and devours Odin. Some researchers see in this a parallel with the Christian image of Satan, who was bound but will be released at the end of time to bring destruction before the final victory of good. Ragnarok is not an instantaneous catastrophe, but a series of signs and events that gradually lead the world to destruction. It all begins with alarming harbingers, followed by the destruction of order, the battle of the gods, and the final fire, sweeping away everything so that a new world can be born in its place. The first signs of the approaching end are the Great Winter, known as Fimbulwinter. These are 3 continuous winters, following one after another without summer. The sky is covered with clouds, the sun seems to lose its strength, and snowstorms do not stop. Cold penetrates all corners of the world, turning rivers into ice, making the soil barren and destroying the harvest. Famine comes, which ignites cruelty in the hearts of people. By this time, the human world is already engulfed in chaos. Brothers rise up against each other. No one can trust even their relatives. Betrayal and the collapse of social foundations reign everywhere. Wars break out all over the world, and it becomes clear every day. The old order is collapsing and no one can save it anymore. When the world plunges into chaos, ancient monsters awaken from the depths, whose wrath is predetermined by fate. The great wolf Fenrir, bound by the gods since childhood, breaks his bonds and goes free. The wolf's mouth is so large that it can swallow an entire celestial body. The serpent Jormungandr rises from the ocean, writhing all over the world and poisoning it with its breath. From Muspelheim, the fiery land, comes the giant Surtur with a sword, shining like the sun. All these are signs that the last battle has begun, a battle in which even the gods will not be able to escape their fate. The forces of gods and monsters converge on the battlefield called Vigrider. Odin fights with Fenrir, but fate has long been predetermined. The wolf grabs him with his giant jaws and swallows the great god. Thor enters the battle with Jormungandr, destroying the serpent with his hammer. But having only taken a couple of steps after the victory, he himself falls, poisoned by the deadly fumes of the monster. Loki, a former ally of the gods, now stands against Heimdallr, and in this battle they kill each other. At this moment, the giant Surtur raises his flaming sword and incinerates the entire world. Fiery waves engulf the earth, the sky cracks, and all living things turn to ashes. Ragnarok is not just a myth about the end of the world, but a symbolic story filled with deep meanings. It can be viewed not only as a mythological prophecy, but also as an allegory of historical changes, an attempt to comprehend the chaos and destruction that invariably accompany the change of eras. That is why it remains relevant even centuries after it was recorded. One of the most interesting interpretations of Ragnarok is its understanding as a change of eras. The plot is based on the idea of the death of the old world, which was full of conflicts, suffering, and sins, so that a new, renewed world could be born in its place. Such a concept is found in many cultures. For example, the Mayan civilization believed that our world is not the first, but only one of many cycles ending in catastrophe. Hinduism describes the era of Kali Yuga, a time of moral decay, after which destruction and a new golden age will inevitably come. Parallels can also be drawn with the Christian apocalypse. The description of Ragnarok largely resembles the prophecy of the end times from the revelation of John the theologian. In both cases, there is a series of omens, natural disasters, the fall of great forces, and the final battle of good and evil. In the Christian tradition, a new world remains after the day of judgment, where only the righteous live. Just as after Ragnarok, the earth is renewed, and the surviving souls begin a new era. Some researchers suggest that Christian ideas could have influenced later versions of the myth, especially those that were recorded in the 13th century, after the spread of Christianity in Scandinavia. But can we assume that the myth of Ragnarok is inspired by real events? Researchers have repeatedly searched for possible events that could have left a mark on the collective memory of the ancient Scandinavians. One of the hypotheses links the legend with climate changes that occurred in the 6th century, when a series of volcanic eruptions led to a sharp cold snap, crop failure, and mass famine. The Scandinavians could have remembered this crisis as the eternal winter, which was later reflected in the myth of Fimbulwinter. Another theory links Ragnarok with the eruption of the Hekla volcano in Iceland, or possible meteorite strikes that caused the eclipse of the sun. Despite its ancient roots, Ragnarok remains one of the most popular myths in mass culture. It has repeatedly appeared in books, films, and video games, changing depending on the era. In the 20th century, this myth was often interpreted as a premonition of global wars. In modern pop culture, it has become part of the image of Scandinavian mythology, especially thanks to Marvel comics and films. In games such as God of War or Assassin's Creed Valhalla, it is shown as a dramatic moment when the old order collapses and the heroes face fate. Thus, Ragnarok is a powerful myth about destruction and rebirth, which can be interpreted in different ways depending on the context, whether it is a historical change of eras, religious predictions, or real natural disasters. This myth continues to resonate in the human consciousness, making it one of the most significant plots in the history of mankind. When it comes to ancient prophecies about the end of the world, one of the most famous examples is the Mayan calendar and the predictions supposedly associated with the date December 21st, 2012. At the beginning of the 21st century, this idea gave rise to a real cultural phenomenon: disaster films, pseudoscientific theories, and mass hysteria. But what does this date really mean for the Maya? Is it a real prophecy or just a misinterpretation? The myth that the Maya predicted the end of the world arose due to the peculiarities of their calendar system. Unlike the linear chronology familiar to us, the Maya used cycles which were based on so-called baktuns, time intervals, each of which lasted approximately 394 years. One great cycle of the calendar consisted of 13 baktuns and covered a period of 5,125 years. This cycle, according to calculations, ended precisely on December 21st, 2012, which gave rise to rumors about the coming apocalypse. However, for the Maya themselves, this did not mean the end of all things, but only a change of era. Just as in modern culture, the end of the millennium is perceived not as the end of the world, but as an important historical milestone. The real essence of the Mayan calendar is related to their ideas about time as repeating cycles. They believed that each world exists for a certain period and then is replaced by a new one. There have already been several such worlds in their mythology. It is known from the book Popol Vuh that previous worlds were destroyed by flood, fire, or monsters, and our modern world is already the fourth or fifth attempt of divine creation. However, no Mayan source claims that the world will cease to exist after the completion of the current cycle. One of the few archaeological sources that actually mentions the date December 21st, 2012, is an inscription from Tortuguero, an ancient Mayan monument in the Mexican state of Tabasco. This text says that the 13th Baktun, associated with war, chaos, and change, will end on this day. However, the rest of the text is damaged, and it is impossible to say exactly what was supposed to happen. Moreover, many other Mayan texts mention dates far beyond 2012, which confirms that they did not consider this moment the end of time. Thus, the myth about the end of the world in 2012 arose due to a misunderstanding of the concept of time in Mayan culture. They did not predict the apocalypse, but only spoke about the completion of one cycle and the beginning of a new one. The Mayan ideas about the end of the world were much more complex than the popular myths about the predicted apocalypse in 2012. Their worldview was based on the idea of the cyclical nature of time, and their mythology viewed the end of times not as absolute destruction, but as a stage in the cycle of destruction and rebirth. This concept is most clearly manifested in their idea of the fifth sun, the era in which we live today. According to Mayan cosmology, the universe exists in the form of successive worlds, each of which lives for a certain number of years and then perishes in a catastrophe. They believed that before our time, there were 4 worlds ruled by different gods, but they all sooner or later came to an end. This concept is very similar to the ideas of other civilizations, such as the Aztecs, who also use the term fifth sun to refer to the current era. According to this theory, we live in a world that was preceded by 4 destroyed civilizations, each of which perished due to the interference of the elements: water, wind, fire, and earth. However, no source says that the end of the fifth sun will necessarily occur on a pre-known date. This is only an inevitable process that will happen someday, but its exact timing is unknown. Mayan cosmology presents the world as a temporary construct created by the gods, but doomed to destruction. They did not perceive the existence of the universe as something constant or eternal. Everything moves in a predetermined cycle, and when one era ends, another begins. In this respect, their worldview differs from the linear view of time common in Abrahamic religions, but is similar to the Hindu concept of great time cycles succeeding one another. One of the most important myths related to the end of the previous world is the legend of the flood. In Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Maya, it is told how the gods created the first people, but they turned out to be imperfect. The first people were created from clay, but they were too fragile, and the rains washed them off the face of the earth. Then the gods tried to create them from wood, but the wooden people did not have a soul and did not express respect to their creators, for which they were destroyed by a great flood. After that, the gods created new people from corn dough, and only they became real people, worthy of living in the world created by the gods. This myth reflects the importance of corn for Mayan culture, as well as their idea that humanity is not the first attempt of the gods, but the result of a long process of trial and error. Thus, in the real Mayan predictions about the end of the world, there is no specific date or accurate prophecy about the coming catastrophe. They perceived the world as temporary and knew that it would disappear sooner or later, but they did not try to establish the exact moment of its death. The history of the Maya does not end with their classical period, and even more so, is not limited to myths about the end of the world. On the contrary, their cultural and religious beliefs continued to exist and change even after contact with the Europeans. One of the little-known facts is how the Mayan religion adapted to colonization, gradually incorporating elements of Christianity into its old myths. When the Spaniards conquered the Mayan lands in the 16th century, they sought to eradicate paganism, but it turned out to be impossible to completely destroy the ancient faith. As a result, a unique form of religious syncretism arose, in which traditional Mayan gods and myths became intertwined with Catholic symbolism. For example, the sun god Kinich Ahau became associated with the image of Jesus Christ, and the underworld of Xibalba began to be compared to Christian hell. Many Mayan rituals and holidays did not disappear, but simply received a new interpretation. Sacrifices were replaced by prayers, and ancient temples became places of Christian worship. This process can be compared to how the Vikings adapted their beliefs to Christianity, or how African cults were formed into voodoo and Santeria. Another aspect that is rarely discussed is the real catastrophes that could have influenced the decline of the Mayan civilization. Despite the mystical aura surrounding their myths, archaeological data shows that the cause of their disappearance was not prophecies, but quite material crises. Climate studies indicate prolonged periods of drought that began around the 9th century and could have led to water shortages and famine. In addition, frequent earthquakes destroyed cities, which aggravated the situation. Perhaps even uprisings of the lower classes became another factor that undermined the stability of the Mayan world. As a result, by the 15th century, most of their cities were abandoned, and the descendants of the ancient Maya faced Spanish expansion. Thus, the religious beliefs of the Maya not only survived colonization, but also continued to evolve. Their civilization disappeared not because of a mystical prophecy, but under the influence of real catastrophes. And the very concept of the cyclical nature of the world makes their beliefs related to the myths of other peoples. The story of the Great Flood is one of the most common myths in world culture. It is found on different continents and in very different traditions, but everywhere it carries a similar meaning. A world engulfed in chaos or sin plunges underwater to be renewed later. The question arises, why is the myth of the flood so universal? Is it a memory of a real catastrophe, or is it an archetype reflecting ancient fears of the element of water? One of the most famous versions of the flood myth is found in the Bible. According to the book of Genesis, God saw that humanity had become mired in sin and decided to destroy it, saving only the righteous Noah and his family. At God's command, Noah built an ark and took animals onto it, a pair of each species. After that, torrential rains fell on the earth, and the waters flooded the entire world. After 40 days, the flood began to recede. The ark came to rest on Mount Ararat, and Noah released a dove, which brought back an olive branch, becoming a symbol of hope and new beginnings. In this story, the flood serves as divine punishment, but also as a cleansing, after which humanity gets a second chance. However, the biblical flood myth has obvious parallels with the more ancient Sumerian tradition. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, recorded several millennia before the Bible, there is a story about King Utnapishtim, who was informed by the gods of an upcoming flood and ordered to build a large ship. Utnapishtim saves his family, craftsmen, and animals. After the water subsides, he makes sacrifices to the gods, for which he receives immortality. This plot almost completely coincides with the story of Noah's Ark, suggesting that the biblical myth may have been borrowed from, or at least inspired by, Sumerian sources. In Greek mythology, there is also a tale of a flood, but its emphasis is slightly different. Zeus, angered by humans for their wickedness, decided to destroy them. However, the god Prometheus warned his son, Deucalion. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha built an ark, survived the catastrophe, and finding themselves on Mount Parnassus, became the parents of a new humanity. Unlike the biblical myth, where people already existed after the flood, the Greek myth makes Deucalion and Pyrrha the only survivors, and the creation of a new humanity occurs symbolically. They throw stones behind their backs, from which men and women are born. This emphasizes the idea not only of punishment, but also of purification, renewal, and a new order. Interestingly, flood myths are found not only in Europe and the Middle East, but also around the world. In India, the Mahabharata tells of Manu, who learned of an upcoming flood and was saved with the help of a divine fish. In Chinese tradition, there is the myth of the great Yu, who, after a catastrophic flood, taught people how to manage the waters and build dams. In the myths of the peoples of the Americas, from the Aztecs to the Incas, there are also stories of a flood. One hypothesis is that the flood myth is connected to memories of real floods that left a deep mark on the memory of ancient peoples. For example, some scientists link the legend of the flood to the flooding of the Black Sea around 7,500 years ago, when water from the Mediterranean Sea broke into the Black Sea, sharply raising its level. Other researchers point to climate change after the last ice age, when the melting of glaciers led to massive floods. However, there is another explanation. The flood myth is a universal symbol of destruction and renewal, reflecting the idea that before a new order can begin, the old world must be destroyed. Water in mythology often symbolizes purification. It is not surprising that different cultures independently came to a similar idea of the flood as a grand transition from one world to another. Myths about the Great Flood may seem purely symbolic, but more and more research indicates that they may conceal real geological events. Although ancient peoples may not have understood the scientific reasons for these catastrophes, their myths may have been attempts to explain catastrophic natural phenomena that left an indelible mark on their collective memory. One of the most common hypotheses links the flood myth to the global melting of glaciers that occurred approximately 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. Huge masses of ice that covered a significant portion of the northern hemisphere began to melt. Water, released after millennia of freezing temperatures, flooded low-lying areas, destroying coastal settlements of ancient peoples. This process may have lasted for centuries, but its consequences were colossal. Sudden floods may have seemed like apocalyptic events, memories of which were preserved in myths. Another theory, which we have already mentioned, links the biblical flood to a geological catastrophe in the Black Sea region. According to geologists, approximately 7,500 years ago, the level of the Mediterranean Sea rose sharply, and water broke into the Black Sea through the Bosporus Strait. Vast territories that had previously been land were flooded, and a freshwater lake turned into a saltwater sea. For the people inhabiting these lands, the disaster could indeed have looked like the end of the world. Strong currents of water destroyed their settlements, forcing them to flee, and memories of this event could eventually transform into the myth of the Great Flood. Another hypothesis considers tsunamis and megafloods as a possible source of the flood myth. In the history of the Earth, there are known cases when giant waves, caused by underwater earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, could instantly destroy coastal civilizations. For example, the eruption of the volcano on the island of Santorini about 3,600 years ago caused a colossal tsunami that struck the coast of Crete and other parts of the Aegean region. Perhaps similar disasters occurred in earlier epochs, leaving behind only memories that over time turned into myths. But could a group of people survive such a flood? Historical examples show that survivors could indeed have existed. If the flood lasted long enough, people had time to escape to higher ground or even build floating structures, similar to those described in the myths. It is quite possible that the stories of heroes who escaped death in the water are ancient tales of those who managed to escape during natural disasters. Thus, myths about the flood, however fantastic they may seem, may have real natural foundations. Catastrophic climate changes, tectonic processes, and natural disasters could have left a mark on the memory of ancient civilizations, turning into one of the most enduring stories in human history. But where did the idea of the Ark, a floating refuge in which the chosen ones escape from the elements, come from? This image may have had a practical origin. Ancient people, faced with floods, could build rafts or boats to wade out the water. Archaeologists are finding traces of primitive wooden structures in places where catastrophic rises in water occurred thousands of years ago. However, the Ark is not just a ship, but a symbol of salvation and hope. It is built by divine instruction, and its inhabitants represent either the righteous, like Noah, or people carrying knowledge and culture that must be preserved for the future world. In later interpretations, the Ark becomes an image of any refuge that offers a chance of survival. From medieval fortresses to modern concepts of spaceships that could save humanity in the event of a global catastrophe. In our time, the flood myth takes on new forms associated with modern fears. Climate change caused by human activity is increasingly perceived as a new great flood. Rising sea levels, melting glaciers, extreme weather events, all of this makes people think about the future of the planet. In scientific circles, scenarios are being discussed in which coastal cities may be underwater, and millions of people will be forced to migrate in search of safe lands. These anxieties are reflected in mass culture, from post-apocalyptic films where the world is submerged in water to real studies that model the possible consequences of a climate disaster. Unlike most myths, in which the end of the world is depicted as destruction and catastrophe, Zoroastrianism offers a different concept, frashakareti, which can be translated as renewal or bringing the world to perfection. In this religious tradition, the end of the world does not mean the death of humanity, but, on the contrary, represents the final victory of good over evil and the restoration of the divine order. According to Zoroastrian teachings, the world was created by the god Ahura Mazda, pure and perfect, but the evil spirit Angra Mainyu, Ahriman, brought chaos, disease, wars, and death into it. Since then, the history of humanity has been a struggle between light and dark forces in which people play a key role. Each person, through their actions, either brings closer the victory of good or strengthens evil. However, this battle is not eternal. At the end of time, there will be a decisive battle in which Ahura Mazda and his immortal helpers will finally destroy Angra Mainyu and all the forces of darkness. Fire, which plays a central role in Zoroastrianism, will become an instrument of purification. The world will pass through molten metal, which will destroy evil, but the righteous will be able to pass through it without suffering harm. After that, a new era will come, an era of perfection. All the dead will be resurrected, but in a new form, without diseases and vices. Humanity will unite, conflicts and sufferings will disappear, and the earth itself will become a paradise. Ahura Mazda will establish an eternal order in which evil can no longer manifest itself. This myth differs from many other ideas about the end of the world in that it is filled with optimism. If in Ragnarok the world perishes in fire, and in the Christian apocalypse terrible disasters precede Judgment Day, in Zoroastrianism, the end of the world is a long-awaited deliverance from all that is bad. In essence, it is not the end, but the beginning of an ideal world in which the original intention of the Creator is fulfilled. Interestingly, many elements of Zoroastrian eschatology resonate in later religions. For example, the idea of the resurrection of the dead is present in Christianity and Islam, and the final battle of light and darkness resembles the eschatological plots of different cultures. This shows that even such ancient myths as the Zoroastrian one continue to influence people's worldview, shaping the idea of the future and the hope for the ultimate triumph of justice. In Japanese mythological tradition, there is no single eschatological scenario. There is a belief that the world is not eternal, and its existence depends on maintaining harmony between the gods, nature, and people. If this balance is disturbed, the world may come to its end. The Shinto concept of the universe is based on the idea of kami, divine spirits that govern the elements, natural phenomena, and even human destinies. As long as people revere the gods and maintain order, the world exists. But if traditions are forgotten and the moral and natural order is violated, the gods may turn away from humanity, and then chaos will ensue. In this sense, Japanese eschatology is not based on one decisive event, but is associated with a gradual decline due to the loss of sacred balance. However, in some Japanese myths, there is a character whose return is associated with the end of the world. Susanoo, the god of storm and chaos. In traditional myths, he is an unrestrained, violent force who, although belonging to the pantheon of the main gods, often acts against established norms. According to some legends, at the end of time, he will return to destroy the world, just as the Scandinavian Loki or the Hindu Kali bring the end of an old era. Unlike Ragnarok, where the battle of good and evil ends with the rebirth of a new world, Japanese myths do not give a clear answer to what will happen after the destruction. This idea of chaos as a threat to world order is reflected in Japanese culture and philosophy. In historical periods of crisis, such as civil wars and natural disasters, the Japanese often perceived what was happening as signs of a loss of harmony. In literature and cinema, this motif is also manifested in images of apocalyptic disasters that symbolize the loss of connection between people, nature, and the spiritual world. Thus, the Japanese concept of the end of the world is not associated with an inevitable catastrophic event, but with the state of the world, depending on the observance of sacred order. In this sense, it resembles some Buddhist ideas about the gradual deterioration of the world to its complete destruction, after which a new cycle of existence may begin. In Slavic mythology, there is no single and clear idea of the end of the world, similar to the Scandinavian Ragnarok or the Christian apocalypse. However, in folk beliefs, there are images and prophecies that can be interpreted as eschatological. The main idea is that the world may perish due to a violation of the natural order, after which either eternal darkness or a purifying fire ensues. One of the symbols of chaos in Slavic folklore is Morok, a spirit associated with darkness, fear, and delusion. In folk legends, he does not so much bring the end of the world as shroud people's minds, depriving them of the ability to distinguish between good and evil. According to beliefs, if the world plunges into chaos and loses touch with traditions and divine order, people will be at the mercy of Morok, which will lead to the complete disintegration of society. In this sense, the idea of spiritual darkness as a sign of an impending cataclysm is similar to the idea of moral decline in Buddhist and Christian prophecies. Another motif found in Slavic legends is associated with the destruction of the world by fire. In some tales, there is talk of a burning sea or a flame that will engulf the earth before the end of time. Unlike the biblical flood, where destruction comes through water, here the emphasis is on the purifying element of fire. Although folk tales sometimes mention the revival of nature, there is no convincing evidence that the Slavs had the idea of recurring cycles of the end of the world, as in the Mayan or Hindu tradition. However, the concept of destroying the old world before creating a new one is still traced in some beliefs. For example, in fairy tales, you can find plots about the death of a kingdom or land, which are then reborn in a new, updated form. Slavic legends about the end of time are not recorded in sacred texts as in the Abrahamic religions, but were transmitted orally, and therefore they are more difficult to study and interpret. Nevertheless, the key idea remains unchanged. If the world loses its divine order and plunges into chaos, it will face destruction, after which a new era is possible. These motifs resonate in later Slavic culture, including in fairy tales, folklore, and even literary works of the 19th-20th centuries. Thus, although the Slavs do not have a strict canonical description of the end of the world, their mythology contains many images of chaos, darkness, and purifying fire, which symbolize the destruction of the old world and the possibility of its renewal. Germanic and Celtic mythologies do not offer a single eschatological scenario, but contain motifs of battle, destruction, and possible renewal, which can be seen as peculiar prophecies about the end of time. These legends are not always associated with the idea of an inevitable catastrophe, but they emphasize the fragility of world order and its dependence on the balance of power between gods, people, and spirits. Among the Germanic peoples, the most famous myth about the end of the world is Ragnarok, described in the Scandinavian tradition. However, there are other, lesser-known Germanic legends in which the world is destroyed in a great battle of the gods, or because the connection between people and higher powers is broken. Some Germanic tales speak of the arrival of the Black Sun, a sign of the end of time when the world will plunge into darkness, and the forces of chaos will come out of their hiding places. This motif echoes the ideas of Fimbulwinter, the eternal winter before Ragnarok. In Germanic and Celtic myths, there is often the idea of a hero who will return in the hour of greatest danger. For example, in the legends of King Arthur, who has both Celtic and Germanic roots, It is said that he did not die, but only sleeps in a secret place and will return when Britain is threatened by the greatest danger. This motif is also found in the myths of Frederick Barbarossa, who, according to legends, sleeps in a cave in the mountains and will one day wake up to save Germany. These legends do not so much predict the end of the world as promise hope for rebirth in the darkest hour. Celtic mythology, unlike Germanic, is much less focused on the end of the world in the usual sense. However, it has motifs of the destruction of worlds and the transition between eras. One of the key ideas of Celtic mythology is the existence of many worlds that can come into contact with each other, be destroyed, or disappear. For example, Irish mythology tells of the arrival of the Tuatha Dé Danann, a divine people who ruled Ireland but then gave way to humans. Their world did not disappear completely, but went into another dimension, becoming invisible to ordinary mortals. In some versions of the legends, it is said that the Tuatha Dé Danann can return and restore their power, which can be interpreted as some form of world renewal after its destruction. Another important motif of Celtic mythology is the eternal cycles of destruction and rebirth. Unlike linear ideas about the end of the world, as in the Christian tradition, the Celts perceived the world as constantly changing. In the legends of the battles of the gods, the flooding of ancient lands, for example, the myth of the death of the city of Lyonesse, which allegedly went underwater, one can see echoes of the idea that the old order always gives way to the new. An important role in Celtic prophecies was played by druids, priests, and soothsayers who could predict the future. Some legends speak of druids warning of impending destruction if people forget ancient traditions and lose touch with the gods. This motif is reminiscent of Slavic ideas about the loss of harmony as a harbinger of the end of time. Despite the lack of a clear concept of the end of the world, Germano-Celtic myths contain many elements characteristic of eschatological beliefs: a great battle, the destruction of the old world, the return of ancient heroes, and cycles of renewal. These ideas influenced European culture, especially in the legends of King Arthur, the legends of sleeping warriors, and folk beliefs about sunken lands that will one day rise again from the depths. In modern culture, the motifs of Germano-Celtic eschatology continue to live in literature, cinema, and philosophical concepts. The idea of sleeping heroes awakening in the hour of danger is reflected in the plots of fantasy and science fiction. The idea that the world can be destroyed not suddenly, but through gradual changes, is similar to modern theories about global crisis, climate change, and the loss of cultural traditions. Thus, although Germano-Celtic myths do not give us a single scenario for the end of the world, they reflect important ideas. World order is not eternal, but destruction is always followed by rebirth. And even in the darkest times, there is hope for the restoration of what has been lost. African and oceanic myths about the end of the world, unlike European and Middle Eastern traditions, do not always present the catastrophe as the final destruction of the world. In many cases, it is about returning the universe to its original state, cyclical renewal, or divine punishment that can be reversed if people change their behavior. These myths are closely linked to ideas about the harmony between nature, the gods, and society, and destruction is seen as an inevitable consequence of disrupting this balance. Among the peoples of Africa, there are myths that the gods may be disappointed in humanity and destroy it. For example, in the mythology of the Yoruba people, there is the idea of the supreme god Olodumare, who created the world and people but left the management to lower deities, Orisha. However, If humanity loses its moral foundations and ceases to worship the gods, the world will return to the state of primary chaos from which it was created. In this myth, the end of the world is not associated with final death, but with the idea of correction. Destruction can be prevented if people restore harmony with divine forces. Other African peoples, such as the Zulus and Dogon, believe in a celestial serpent, a similar being that will one day descend from the heavens and burn the earth with its fiery breath. The Dogon have stories of a falling star that will cause chaos and lead to the end of time. These stories can be interpreted as a mythological explanation of natural disasters, such as meteor falls or mass droughts, which could have a devastating impact on civilizations in antiquity. In the mythologies of the peoples of Oceania, especially in Polynesia, there is often a motif of a giant wave that will one day wash away the entire world. In Maori myths, there is talk of a coming day when the ocean will swallow the land and the earth will be destroyed, only to be born again. Some peoples of the Pacific Islands have legends of angry gods sending a flood or famine to humanity when it loses touch with its traditions and ancestors. These myths may be related to memories of tsunamis, which are indeed a serious threat to island civilizations. Interestingly, in the myths of Polynesia and Africa, there is often the idea that the end of the world is retribution for the sins of people, wars, famine, and natural disasters. But people always have the opportunity to restore balance and prevent final catastrophe. This distinguishes them from Western concepts of the end of the world, where the idea of irreversible death is more common. Thus, African and oceanic myths about the end of the world not only describe destruction, but also focus on the need to maintain harmony between the gods, nature, and people. These myths remind us that the fate of the world depends on human actions, and that perhaps catastrophe is not an inevitability but a warning. Ideas about the end of the world have always reflected the fears that were relevant to a particular society in a particular era. In ancient times, these were floods, droughts, and earthquakes. In the Middle Ages, diseases and religious prophecies. And today, fears have become more technological in nature: climate catastrophe, nuclear war, artificial intelligence. Eschatology is a mirror of society, in which its anxieties and ideas about the future are reflected. It has been noticed that during periods of social and political upheaval, talks about the end of the world become especially frequent. When the usual order collapses, there is a feeling that the world is really coming to its end. For example, at the end of the Roman Empire, many believed that the apocalypse had already begun, as wars were raging around, the economy was in decline, and barbarians were attacking the borders. In the Middle Ages, outbreaks of plague and famine were perceived as signs of Judgment Day. In the 20th century, the fear of nuclear war resulted in the popularity of post-apocalyptic scenarios, where humanity destroys itself. If you compare ancient myths with modern theories about the end of the world, you can see that they work on a similar principle. In mythology, the end of the world comes from the wrath of the gods or the destructive forces of nature, followed by renewal. Today, fears are also associated with destruction, which may be followed by a reboot of civilization, either in the form of technological singularity or in the form of a new environmental reality. Climate change is often perceived as a new Great Flood, threatening to destroy coastal cities and lead to global chaos. The fear of artificial intelligence is reminiscent of stories about the rebellion of titans or demons who get out of control. Nuclear war, in essence, is a modern version of Ragnarok, a battle in which there will be no winners. Thus, eschatology not only reflects fears, but also help society make sense of crises. These scenarios, however grim they may be, show that humanity is always waiting for either rebirth or catastrophe. The choice between them, as in ancient myths, depends on ourselves.